Greetings from Cooperstown, New York, side of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. It's a beautiful early summer day here in Cooperstown, and we're very glad you could join us for our virtual author series. Today, we will talk to our old friend, Paul Hensler. He has written the new book, Gathering Crowds, Catching Baseball Fever in the New Era of Free Agency, looking at the game mid to late 1970s through the 1980s. Paul has written several other books on baseball. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And we will take your questions for Paul later in the show. You can actually go right to our Zoom group chat. You can type the questions in there, and we'll handle that a little bit later on in the program. As always, our virtual author series is brought to you through the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. We thank the folks at Ford Motor for sponsoring this and all of our other online programs that we have been doing in 2021. We do appreciate the generosity of the Ford Motor Company. And we appreciate, as always, the presence of Paul Hensler. Paul has written 4 books in total, 3 specifically on the topic of baseball. A frequent visitor to the Cooperstown area for the symposium that we have. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had our first virtual symposium. And Paul presented at that, as he has done live in our Bullpen Theater and other venues here in Cooperstown in the past. We're very glad to have Paul with us. Paul, how you been?
Doing very well, Bruce. Thank you so much for giving me the honor of appearing here on this wonderful series that you put together. And again, everybody adjusting to the pandemic world. And even though we're segueing out of it, Zoom does have its great advantages, as we just discussed a few minutes ago, that we can really draw in a wider audience. So very happy for the opportunity. Thank you.
Well, you're always welcome. This is your 3rd book on baseball, and you really have been tackling this chronologically. Your first book, The American League in Transition, 1965 to 1975. And then you, with your next book, your starting point is the late 1960s, The New Boys of Summer. As I recall, Curt Flood was featured on the cover of that. And now we move into really the late 1970s, 1976, 77, through the 1980s. Did you plan it this way chronologically, or is that just how it's shaken out?
No, it's actually just happenstance. Authors like to joke that we don't write anything until our topic finds us. So we kind of struggle if we go looking for something to write and nothing really clicks or connects. But in this particular instance, stepping back to my second book, that really was an outgrowth of the first book, because book number 1, writing basically 1975 to 1975, a fairly narrow focus with the focus on 3 teams in particular, the Orioles, the Twins, and the Athletics. And with the second book, with New Boys of Summer, I sort of narrowed the time frame down to 2 years, 2 very important transitional years, but I expanded the topics. So that particular topic found me, if you will, the various sub-themes involved with that happened to find me. And in the similar circumstances now with Gathering Crowds, that we look at 1977 as such a transitional year because of the first real year of free agency, and then running through the late 1980s, a convenient bookend, if you'll pardon the pun, with the death of Bart Giamatti in September of 1989. But I carry it just a little bit further because we do have the run out with Fay Vincent becoming a new commissioner, and also having to make the critical decisions after the San Francisco earthquake interrupted the World Series of that year. So as authors struggle to have particular finite set time frames, we do have to kind of stray a little bit at appropriate times. So again, looking at how dynamic the 1980s were is a decade, this 14, 15-year stretch that I'm covering, I found to be have a lot of compelling topics. So thus, this particular book that I ended up overwriting by word count, I had to trim a fair amount out of it to get it down to the publisher's requested size. But I think the finished product came out pretty well in the end. But of course, I'm speaking biasly about that.
Yeah. We always like to talk a little bit about the process of writing a book with our authors, what goes into it, the thinking behind it, some of the mechanics of writing. I want to talk about just a couple of things here. First of all, the title, Gathering Crowds. Is that the name of the theme song for This Week in Baseball? Is that where you came up with that?
For the longest time, we didn't have a title for the book. We didn't even really have a working title. In fact, the files on my email and also the document folders that I have on my computer just very generically, blandly listed as Baseball Book 3, because we really didn't settle on anything. And it probably wasn't up until the point that I was writing the 8th chapter that all of a sudden I realized, and I had long written about the economic portion of the game early on, chapter 2 dealt with the economics, but there's one unescapable fact that with the exception of the strike year of 1981, where attendance, of course, was way down because they lost the full 1/3 of the season due to the strike by the players. But beginning with the year of free agency in 1977, not exactly on a perfect straight line, but attendance seemed to be growing every single year, that the game had more and more appeal. The big name free agents that had signed with the Yankees, for instance, in the late 1970s with Reggie Jackson and Don Gullett, Goose Gossage, that made them a champion and got them out of their doldrums from the late 1960s. All of a sudden, New York becomes a hotbed of baseball interest again. And then that would segue over to interest in the Mets later on in the 1980s. But if you look at total attendance for baseball, you could see it ever increasing every year. And this was noted in the sporting news guides that came out every year. And Jerome Holtzman penned many of those wonderful recaps heading into the next season. That annual publication by the Sporting News was integral to my research. But every year we have increasing attendance. And then all of a sudden, as I'm writing chapter 8, that particular song, you're absolutely right. The song called Gathering Crowds was composed by a British musician. And that was the closing theme of This Week in Baseball, that very regal music, just wonderful. Never get tired of listening to it. And all of a sudden, the thought just struck to me that here I've already written about increased attendance, and now you have a song called Gathering Crowds. Well, that's why the attendance is going up. So you have Gathering Crowds. It just seemed like such a good fit. And this was one of those rare occasions as an author that when I suggested this as the title for the book, they actually got bought into it. Usually the only words that an author doesn't write are the words that go on the cover of the book.
Right.
But this ended up being such a good fit. I think we negotiate a little bit about the subtitle, but they did like Gathering Crowds, and nobody seemed to complain about borrowing the title of that particular song.
Well, it certainly makes sense. Then we have the cover of the book. You can see it in my hand here, also on our screen. And I'm guessing that is a very young Darryl Strawberry in the photo toward the bottom.
Yes, that's correct. And even before we came on the air, I was looking a little more closely at it because I couldn't identify the ballpark. It didn't appear to be Shea Stadium. It seemed to be someplace else, but nonetheless, Darryl Strawberry, the young Strawberry, has a crowd gathering around him seeking autographs. And looking at the press box sort of at the top of the diagonal there, I think that might be Wrigley Field. I'm just making a guess, but it seems to be an older ballpark, and Wrigley Field came to mind. I can't prove that. I don't know where they got the picture or exactly when it was taken, but again, it plays to the theme of these kids are seeking Darryl Strawberry's autograph, and again, there's a small crowd around him, so it still plays to that central theme.
I'm amazed by how young Strawberry looks in the picture. So I'm guessing it's early 80s. Maybe it's a reminder about how we're all getting older, including Darryl himself. In terms of what ballpark it might be in, you've got some Met fans in the crowd there. You've got an Expos fan wearing an Expos helmet, but maybe it is Wrigley Field. It's not entirely apparent. One of the things that you did in putting this together was to do a lot of research here at the Baseball Hall of Fame in our Giamatti Research Center. And in particular, a special collection that we have here, the Bowie Cune papers. Tell us about this collection and why it was so instrumental to what you were trying to do with this book.
It's incredible, the trove of information that is available at the Hall of Fame, not least of which, as you just mentioned, was so integral to my work there on all my baseball projects, on my book projects. Those papers were donated by Cune, and I'm not sure the exact year. I think it was the late 1990s. I'm not sure the exact date. But Jim Gates, who is the librarian emeritus in Cooperstown, And Tim Wiles, who was the research director at that particular time, spent, I think, somewhere along the line of 2 straight weeks sitting down with Bowie Cune and going through all these boxes of papers to get them organized. And it was an extraordinary effort. And I meant to look this up, the guide to the papers that was curated by Claudette Scrafford, the manuscript archivist there in Cooperstown, going through the papers and delineating all the subtopics and getting all that material in a very coherent order so that people like myself, people researching, can go to this particular very lengthy document, but go into that document and say, I want to look at business issues, and I can just do a keyword search and find everything related to, say, labor issues. I can look and find information about marketing just by doing those keyword searches. Obviously, I have to do a little bit more than that. But that guide to the papers that Claudette did was just extremely helpful. And it's been able to help me narrow down my search and not waste my time in being able to guess as far as what material I can actually find. Just to give a point of contrast, I did some research down at the New York Public Library at the Robert Moses paper. Again, this steps off to the New Boys of Summer because I was talking about the construction of ballparks in the 1960s. The papers of Robert Moses were important to me because he was instrumental, of course, Moses was, in the construction of Shea Stadium. And the good news is that the New York Public Library has all of Moses' papers. The bad news is everything is just simply in chronological order. There's nothing delineated by any sub-themes or subtopics. So by my own best guess, and I really lucked out in this manner, was that I picked time frames that I was guessing of when some of the groundwork was being laid for the construction of Shea Stadium. I happened to find some very interesting artifacts, but up in Cooperstown, the way Cune's papers have been organized, it's helped me out tremendously. Of prime importance for the work that I was doing there, there's just folder after folder after folder of executive committee meetings that Cune had with the uppermost echelon of Major League Baseball. So the select version of the executive committee was comprised of a small group of owners and other important people in the commissioner's front office. And looking through those papers, it was just absolutely astounding to see some of the things that Cune hung on to. As much as reviled as Cune is, probably correctly labeled as a stuffed shirt, he comes into like any commissioner, they kind of come into a no-win situation because we think of the commissioners being the all-ruling czar of the game, the same way the commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis was when he came on board in the 1920s following the Black Sox scandal. However, the power structure really is that even though the commissioner is sort of a figurehead lording over the whole game, he actually reports to all the club owners who his employment is dictated by dictated at the pleasure of the club owners. So if you don't curry favor with the owners, you're not going to find yourself up for re-election, or you're going to find yourself at the mercy of a cabal that wants to get rid of you. And that's pretty much what happened to Cune. So there's a lot of up and downs with regard to employment of the commissioner serving at the behest of the club owners. But he accumulated this vast trove of papers that covers everything you could imagine with his daily dealings, the trips that he took. I gave one presentation several years ago about the trip that he took in November 1969. It was a handshake tour, a goodwill tour of Vietnam. And he wrote a very, very moving diary. He kept it in a little notebook that was just a composition book that you would find high school kids using. But he took enough notes that really painted a very interesting picture of the man himself, in his reaction, the emotions he felt visiting wounded troops at hospitals, that sort of thing. And I devoted one particular presentation at the symposium a few years ago to exactly that topic. So we see a human side of the man as well, not just the business-oriented things. But again, with so much material being available at the Hall of Fame, I was able to dig into economic issues of prime importance to the chapter that I wrote about money. And I think we have a slide coming up on that very shortly with relation to issues on collusion. And I'll get to this because I marked it in my copy of the book. This information is available in the cune papers. It's accessible by any researcher, any historian, members of the public, with appropriately making an appointment to visit the Giamatti Center. So nothing is being kept away from the public. It just requires an appointment at the Hall of Fame to actually see this information. And the more you dig into it, the more you find. When I wrote the chapter on marketing, same idea. I was able to find some papers that were saved from 1982 that shows baseball's efforts to try to get themselves out in the public eye more with regard to merchandising, putting logos on all sorts of merchandise. And this was expanded when Cune's successor, Peter Ubroth, came into office. So there's so much to be found in the Cune papers, and it does cast the man a little bit of a different light. And when I was in college in the late 1970s, I kind of had the same idea of Bowie Cune being the stuffed shirt. And his famous saying, of course, was he was making these rulings in the best interest of baseball. And that almost became a running joke because it seemed like anything that he was ruling on, he was always falling back on that as an excuse. So again, he was reviled in many instances for that. But looking through so much material that he donated to the Hall of Fame, it really does cast him in a different light. And I've been very privileged to spend a lot of time looking at a fair amount of those papers.
As you indicate, the Bowie Cune collection of papers is something that cannot be accessed online. It's not yet been digitized. So if people wanted to look at this part of our special collection, they would need to come here to the Hall of Fame, make an appointment to do so. And if anyone is interested in doing that, I'm going to give you our email for the research department, headed up by Cassidy Lent. It's research@baseballhall.org. Again, research@baseballhall.org. Send the email, it'll get to Cassidy. And if you want to make an appointment to see the Cune collection of papers, we'll do our best to make that happen. As you indicate, Paul, the fight over labor, baseball's economic situation, one of the major themes of baseball, late 70s throughout the 1980s. I mean, it's always a big part of the game, but it really started to kind of come to a head in the 70s. These battles between the players and the owners, they became a huge part of the story. Your book starts with that first free agent class, the winter of 1976, 1977. Four names come to mind in particular in that class: Wayne Garland, Bobby Grich, Joe Rudi, and Reggie Jackson. Talk about that.
Yes. Wayne Garland was a product of the Orioles farm system, had a banner year in 1976. I think he won 20 games or came close to winning 20 games, and was very privileged to be able to peddle his services as any other player who was eligible for free agency at that point was able to do. And as the case was also with Bobby Grich, he came up through the Orioles farm system as well, became an all-star, and sort of went home, if you will, by signing with the Angels. He was born in Michigan, but he grew up in Southern California, so it was sort of a homecoming for him. Reggie Jackson, of course, almost needs no introduction. A superstar, budding with the Oakland Athletics, but he opts to play out his option. He's actually traded to the Orioles, and he only spends 5 months in an Orioles uniform, but almost puts the Orioles into the driver's seat in the American League East. I remember, again, my middle years of college, how exciting that summer was, that there were sold out games at Yankee Stadium, that the Orioles were coming to town. And this was really the big Earl Weaver versus Billy Martin, I hate to say feud, but the rivalry is the better word for it, that the Orioles really had one of those powerhouse teams that didn't win their divisional pennant. So these players are very, very instrumental in helping their new teams, with the exception of Wayne Garland, who almost immediately developed arm trouble and was never the pitcher that he was in that one glowing season that he had with the Orioles. But nonetheless, the fight over labor here really starts to take root in 1966 when Marvin Miller becomes the executive director of the Players Association. And he very slowly builds a track record to earn the trust of the players, because the players were a very conservative-minded group of guys who felt that the owners were taking care of them. Yeah, they were always concerned that the owners were never paying them enough money, But Miller won these small, significant victories that finally culminated in the first major issue of getting arbitration rights for the players to be able to go to an independent panel and have the players submit a salary figure, the owner of his team submit a salary figure, and the arbitrator has to pick and choose between one or the other. They can compromise at any time, but once the case actually goes to arbitration, whatever the arbitrator decides, he makes the decision to say, okay, the salary is going to be pick one figure or the other, the player's figure or the owners. But in many of these cases, we found that the players were becoming victorious because they were able to correctly state their case that they were more valuable than what the owner was willing to pay them. So the salaries are getting ratcheted up in that respect. But the big decision of the Messersmith decision by Peter Seitz in December 1975 really turns the tide, that this basically strikes down the reserve clause and allows players to, with appropriate amount of service time, 6 years initially, to play one more year at the club's option and then put themselves on an open market for selling their services to the highest bidder. And thus, players like Reggie Jackson and Joe Rudy and Don Baylor were able to peddle their services elsewhere. It decimated the Oakland Athletics because they had 6 prime players who decided to leave simultaneously. They all fit the category of the criteria of being able to move on if they so chose. So they lost the whole heart and soul of their team. And Jackson had already been traded away for Don Baylor, was part of that exchange. And Baylor left after only playing one season in Oakland. He ended up going to the California Angels. So this really kicks off a brand new era. And it's one very, very important instance of Marvin Miller once again having the upper hand and gaining victory for the players. And more players are coming over to his side because they realize what Marvin Miller is getting for them, not just financial benefits, but just basic rights with regard to labor issues and going up against management. So I happened to choose the particular cover of the Sporting News, which just looking at, it appears to be from May 1981. So this was just before the terrible players' strike took hold in early June of 1981. That Raygreeby and Raygreeby was the head of the Player Relations Committee, or the owners' negotiating team. Cune was the man in the middle, and of course Marvin Miller is on the opposite side. So this was the biggest labor fight that we had, a big in-season strike that took place that was far more devastating than the short work stoppage at the beginning of 1972. And this very sadly served to be sort of a precursor of what happened in 1994 with the players' strike that killed the season in early August and wrecked the whole rest of the season. There were no playoffs or anything of that nature. But again, you can't talk about baseball history without getting involved in labor issues at one point or another.
Paul, we see these 3 main players here: Marvin Miller, Hall of Famer; Bowie Kuhn, Hall of Famer, both extremely well known. Raygreeby, whom you mentioned, you see him. He's one of the 3 pictured in the Sporting News drawing, but he's also the one on the right side of your screen as well. He is not as well known a figure. Tell us about Raygreeby and what his involvement was like in 1981. Was he any match for Miller at all? Was he able to get anything done from the owner's perspective, or was this a complete victory for Miller?
This really ended up being a victory for Miller. If we step back just 1 year, and I remember this vividly, I had made plans in late May to go to a baseball game down in New York. And there were all sorts of dark clouds were rumbling saying, this is it, the players are really going to go out on strike. And there was a miraculous 11th hour negotiation that actually put off any strike action on the part of the players for one more year. It quote unquote, it allowed cooler heads to prevail. But nonetheless, Greeby bought some time for the owners. But once again, going through the same machinations pretty much 1 year later, the Greeby ended up falling by the wayside too. That he too was outsmarted by Miller. The owners did get the benefit of collecting strike insurance that they took out with Lloyd's of London, which kind of was a funny episode unto itself. That it was kind of interesting that Lloyd's of London even took on that particular underwriting venture. But nonetheless, Raygreeby, as head of the player relations committee, ends up ceding his power, and it seemed like anybody who was involved with the player relations committee was going to fall victim to Marvin Miller again with these slow, methodical victories that Miller was only bargaining on behalf of the players. He's not an attorney. That's one thing perhaps that people forget a lot, that Marvin Miller was an economist. He was not an attorney. He was an economist, but he knew what he was doing. He was at the service of the players, and again, just canny enough to be able to outsmart everybody at virtually every single turn, including Raygreeby, head of the player relations committee at that time.
Did Greeby ever do anything else in baseball? I can't remember hearing his name again after 1981.
No, that was pretty much the end of the line for him. And again, just another Miller victim, if you will.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the other developments, late 70s, early 80s. Some topics here: revenue sharing, the proliferation of superstations like WTBS, and then a bit later on, we have the collusion of the mid to late 1980s. Let's start, Paul, with the topic of revenue sharing. Who was the first to bring this up? When was it first brought up?
Well, one thing that works in favor of the argument for revenue sharing is that small market teams just didn't have the ability to compete financially with the big market teams. We had teams like, of course, we default immediately to the New York Yankees, Los Angeles Dodgers, the big market teams who were able to sell the broadcasting rights to their games at a much higher figure because they had a broader audience, a broader appeal. The Yankees in particular did not want to partake in revenue sharing. If you look through some of the cune papers, there's been more than a few references to this, referred to as creeping socialism. We don't want to have a team like the Yankees spending all kinds of money to make themselves a championship team and then having to give money away to a team like the Kansas City Royals or the Pittsburgh Pirates or the Minnesota Twins because, well, too bad for them. If they can't compete, then that's not our problem. I believe it was Gabe Paul came up with a really great quote saying, "We're not going to spend money and try to build a championship team, only to end up in second place. We're spending this money because we want to win." And from the business standpoint, that makes perfect sense. But again, you had teams like Pittsburgh and Milwaukee, the smaller markets that just didn't have an ability to compete money-wise. So revenue sharing was always a dirty phrase, if you will. And by the time we got into the 1990s, when we saw when owners were able to see the light a little bit better, then we came into a revenue sharing type of a scenario, which had already existed in the NFL and the NBA for quite a number of years. Baseball finally saw the light too and was able to instill that, but it took quite a bit of teeth pulling to be able to implement that. The superstations I carry under the money chapter also, because now we have stations like WTBS, Ted Turner down in Atlanta, having satellite broadcasting. This becomes an issue because you have a company such as Gaylord Broadcasting down in Texas, who, besides the Atlanta Braves beaming long distance signals, why go to the ballpark to watch a live game when I can sit home in my living room and I can watch live baseball right there? So Ted Turner and WTBS like to brand themselves as America's team for the Atlanta Braves. That was their catchphrase. And there was a lot of fear about this, just the same as many, many years ago. Oh my God, we have radio coming on board. And they want to broadcast baseball games over the radio. People aren't going to want to go to the ballpark because they're going to stay home and listen to the game on the radio. That was debunked, just the same as broadcasting games on television, just the same as when the superstations came along. That too kind of was a weak argument, as it was proved out. And again, here we have the title of my book, Gathering Crowds, that we had the superstations that were carrying more and more baseball, but we also had more people that were physically going to the ballpark to enjoy the event live and in person. So the money just seemed to be rolling on. And again, all due to increased popularity of the game, which in no small part was contributed to by the fact that once we got to 1981, the Yankees didn't drop out of contention. They had contending teams through the 1980s, but all of a sudden now we have teams like the Milwaukee Brewers participating in the World Series in 1982. We had the Minnesota Twins in 1987 coming on board. Detroit is a smaller market team. They won the World Series. They had a fabulous team in 1984. So it's not all of a sudden now, it's not just always the Dodgers and always the Yankees who are competing for the big money and the big prizes that the game has to offer. Very compelling arguments in all cases with regard to the smaller markets coming to the fore. Kansas City Royals, for example, in 1985 was another prime example. And also all to their benefit too, because as we'll get to another slide very shortly, they were able to put the drug scandal of the early 1980s behind them too. So again, adding to the popularity of the game, it's not just the big teams that are doing well, it's also these smaller market teams as well.
Yeah.
And the last subtopic here of collusion, I deal with this because by the time we get into Peter Ueberroth's tenure, beginning in October of 1984, he has a very different business approach to the game. And he's very money oriented. He's a very successful businessman. He came to Major League Baseball as the new commissioner after the conclusion of the Summer Olympic Games in Los Angeles in 1984. So he was very instrumental in making that venture a success. He carried his big business acumen with him when he came to the commissionership. However, baseball decided all of a sudden the owners are no longer bidding on big name free agents. And I use Andre Dawson there on the slide as a prime example. Here you have a future Hall of Famer, as he proved to be, fantastic career with the Montreal Expos. Players like him and Lance Parrish and Kirk Gibson were playing out their options. And here you have these wonderful players, the best at the game, and all of a sudden there are no teams bidding for their services. So this really starts to have a very nasty odor to it. And long story short, although I cover it in detail in the book, is there's collusion on the part of the owners who are just basically turning a blind eye to signing a big name free agent like this, who is obviously going to cost a lot in terms of the money at that particular time. We had, for example, Nolan Ryan signed with the Astros for a long-term contract at $1 million a year. That was the first $1 million a year contract. They kept, these contracts kept growing year by year. And finally, by the mid to late 1980s, all of a sudden, it just seemed awfully strange that top flight talent was no longer, seemed like their services were no longer in style, if you will. But I stepped back in the book because, and I'm just going to a quick quote here because I marked this in the chapter. Under this particular chapter, and this is the one of the joys of going through the Cune papers and finding this particular note came from a September 8th, 1980 executive committee meeting. It says the executive council's meeting of their September meeting include a most compelling passage from the discussion of baseball's financial issues. And I quote here, Cune then discussed with the council discussions in which he had been conducting with Mr. Robert Walker of the Los Angeles firm of Paul Hastings and Janofsky regarding the feasibility of various initiatives which might be undertaken to improve the situation and describe the advice which had been rendered by Mr. Walker with regard to these proposals. We're talking about salaries now. At the conclusion of his explanation, the commissioner emphasized that, and I emphasize this here, certain of the suggested initiatives obviously presented an unacceptable level of legal risk and expressed the view that neither he as commissioner nor baseball as an industry should embark on any program either overtly or surreptitiously which involved such risk. It was his conclusion, therefore, that efforts in this area should be limited to the area of persuasion and jawboning, in quotes, as to where there appeared to be no substantial risk of adverse legal consequence. So here there's this raging debate about the expenses of all the teams collectively in Major League Baseball. But yet we have in Cune's memo here, these very carefully couched terms. And of course, the thing that they're dealing with the most expensive item on the balance sheet is players' salaries. And these are available in graph form. The Ernst & Whinney reports, again, those data figures are available in the Cune papers. I was able to find those. And of course, this memo comes across as a smoking gun, that this was talked about in 1980 about doing something surreptitiously rather than overtly to stanch the growth of players' salaries, perhaps by doing something that is a very adverse risk.
So this was Walker suggesting collusion here.
This is the meeting of Cune at with the executive council, and again, in so many words, this is exactly what they're discussing. The omission of the wording that would further explain what constituted these initiatives and proposals, to say nothing of the unacceptable level of risk involved, presents itself as damning circumstantial evidence that easily leads to the conclusion that something nefarious was at play. Only when Peter Ueberroth became commissioner a few years hence and inculcated the magnates with his business philosophy did collusion begin to blossom.
Hmm. Well, here we have the three commissioners who actually, to be technical, there was a fourth as well. But for the majority of the time that's spanned in your book, it's Bowie Cune, Peter Ueberroth, A. Bartlett Giamatti. I can't really think of three more different personalities and probably three more different styles of running the game.
Absolutely. And what's also compelling about this triumvirate, these gentlemen hold office within a very finite period of years. Cune finally leaves office in 1984 after there was basically a palace coup to get rid of him. There was a cabal of owners in the very early 1980s that were just dissatisfied with the way he was running the game. And then the final straw that broke the camel's back was his seeming inability to forestall a players' strike or do more about solving the players' strike in 1981. That really seemed to be the touchstone moment. But yet, being unable to find a new replacement for him, he kept getting a couple extensions through 1982, 1983. At one of those votes, I think it was an unanimous vote of confidence that they were happy that of the job that Cune was doing. And again, all to the man's credit that here he was so disliked by the select group of owners because the way the voting rules were set up, you had to have a certain percentage in both leagues. And there was a difference between the National League and the American League at that point. 3/4 was necessary in one league, only a simple majority in the other. That's been consistently smoothed over since then. But nonetheless, a small block of owners would have been able to prevent him from retaining office. It would have been very easy for Cune to just say basically to hell with it and then walk away from it because it was no longer his problem and he had fallen out of favor with enough owners to prevent him from continuing on. So all to his credit, he does stay on board to make sure that the game runs as smoothly as it possibly could. When Ueberroth comes in, he's probably the most dispassionate baseball fan, if you will, almost in a sense of a complete opposite of Bart Giamatti, who is probably the most loving of baseball commissioners, a romantic at heart, a man of letters, a Renaissance man, if you will, with his literary background at Yale, being the Yale president before he came to become president of the National League. So yes, there's absolutely an incredible disparity among the personalities. And not only that, but this is only going from basically 1984 to 1989, a period of 5+ years that we have these three different personalities all involved with running the game of Major League Baseball. As Bruce mentioned, and I put it just in parentheses in the heading, the fourth one I didn't want to completely ignore was after Giamatti passed away after being in office for just a little over 5 months in September 1989. Fay Vincent, who was the deputy commissioner, was a specially created position. He becomes the new commissioner of baseball and very unexpectedly thrown into the breach just because of the death of Giamatti at a relatively young age. But I think many people were in agreement that what struck down Giamatti so badly were two things. One was he was a horrific smoker. He took up smoking at a fairly young age in high school, I believe, and never gave up the habit. And being a little bit overweight, smoking not a good thing either. But then the stress of having to deal with the Pete Rose situation in August of that year, very difficult decisions for him to make with regard to suspending Rose, taking control of the situation and trying to put some semblance of closure to that because of the mountain of evidence that was presented against Rose. Here's a man who loves the game so much that he has to do this to one of the game's greatest players and a manager at that particular point in time in Rose's career. that all these things worked in concert against Giamatti's health. And in early September, he passed away from a heart attack when he was trying to get away from it like a week and a half after the Rose verdict. Yeah. He just wanted to steal away to his home on Martha's Vineyard and just relax, just decompress for a while. And I believe it was a Friday when he passed away. I'm not I don't know if I'm correctly remembering that. I think it was a Friday that he had only arrived out in the vineyard the night before, enjoyed a nice dinner, and then all of a sudden something horrifically went wrong with his system. And he died very quickly. And the best efforts by EMTs out there were unsuccessful to bring him back. So it was really quite a shock to the baseball world. But Fay Vincent now gets thrown into the breach, and he does get his sea legs very quickly, that he's able to steer the game through the great earthquake of San Francisco during the 1989 World Series, and give a little bit of stability to the game. And of course, Vincent ultimately suffers the same fate as commissioners who fall out of favor with the owners, and he too is jettisoned in 1983, I believe it was, in the early 1990s. He too is jettisoned, and then the game is basically rudderless until Bud Selig comes in as an interim commissioner, the title he held for many years before he became ultimately the official commissioner many years later. So again, very disparate personalities throughout the 1980s as far as the commissionership is concerned.
Paul, let's tackle the story of drugs in the 1980s. You know, we think about baseball today, and we think about substances players should not be using. Inevitably, it comes to steroids, PEDs. You hear very little, in a way, I guess we should be thankful, we hear very little about cocaine use or heroin use. Most players, thankfully, seem to have steered away from that. Totally different situation in the 1980s. Baseball really reaches a nadir with the Pittsburgh drug trials of 1985. How pervasive do you think was the use of cocaine in 1980s baseball?
Unfortunately, at the major league level, it was probably fairly pervasive. I write someplace in that particular chapter that I was a cover-to-cover reader of the Sporting News, and Howard Balzer was one of the associate editors, and I believe his focus in particular was professional football. But the problem got so bad that he actually had part of his page was devoted to a subsection of his column called the Police Blotter, which dealt with all manner of, this player was arrested for possession, this one was arrested for trafficking, whatever. All this is drug related, and as in sports, as in society, and vice versa. So here we have the very unfortunate circumstance that is compounded from baseball's standpoint, because you have players making a lot of money, they have a lot of discretionary incomes, and they have the attention of the doting public, not least of which are people like Curtis Strong, who was a caterer who had access to major league clubhouses and was able to deal directly with the players. There was a gentleman in Milwaukee, the name escapes me now, the same idea, that he was able to get access to high-profile major league players such as Vida Blue, who's not pictured here, but nonetheless, he was one of the infamous Kansas City Four. Willie Mays Aikens, Vida Blue was with the Royals at that particular time, and two outfielders, Jerry Martin and Willie Wilson, were also swept up in this unfortunate tide. Keith Hernandez developed the problem when he was with St. Louis. He fell out of favor with Whitey Herzog. Hernandez gets traded to the New York Mets. The picture we see of him on the left-hand side there, he's decidedly out of baseball uniform, and he's real well dressed. He's heading to the courthouse in Pittsburgh for his testimony in the trial. When he was traded to the New York Mets, I like to point out the fact that when he came to New York, he actually took up residence in Connecticut. I'm guessing probably Greenwich, Connecticut was just outside the bounds of the city, but he did so on purpose because he wanted to just avoid the city, wanted to avoid any temptation. He wanted to get his life cleaned up as much as possible. And thankfully, taking him under his wing is Rusty Staub, who was on another tour with the New York Mets. It was his third tour with the team. And thankfully, Staub shows him the better sides of the city, the arts, the good things that New York City happened to offer. And it's very instrumental in Hernandez being able to turn his life and his career around and really becomes a team leader among the Mets. So that's one good thing that happened to come out of it at that particular point in his career. Running contrary to that, on the right-hand side, we have a more recent picture of Dwight Gooden, who seemed to have Hall of Fame, and Darryl Strawberry as well, seem to have Hall of Fame careers just plastered all over them with regard to the potential that they had when they first came up with the Mets, and then falling into the drug habit, not only squandering money because they did have a lot of money to spend, but just again, a horrific waste of talent for a team that had so much promise in the mid 1980s. It looked like the Mets at that point were going to have a multi-year dynasty. And although they won the World Series in 1986, they really did very little after that. And again, there's the pernicious effects of what's happening with the drug culture. Baseball was not afflicted by this. They were not in a vacuum. Again, pro football had its issues. The National Basketball Association had issues. Even at the college level, we had college athletes who were also getting involved, but perhaps not to the horrific extent that the professional sports were. And baseball shoots itself in the foot because they can't institute a drug testing program. There are many issues with that. Again, Marvin Miller was instrumental in this too, that the owners wanted to institute some sort of a program that basically said, okay, I'm going to force the players to take a drug test to prove their innocence, which runs contrary to the theory of American law, where you're innocent until proven guilty. Instead of proving guilt, in order to give some sort of credibility, if you will, to the game of baseball, owners wanted to have all the players tested to be able to prove that they were clean. And this rankled feathers among civil libertarians, of course, because we don't have to prove our innocence. That's not the basis of American justice. So this took hold and was very, very unfortunate. And I get toward the end of this particular chapter, I do deal a little bit with performance enhancing drugs and substances. This is really just starting to come on board, even though steroid usage dates back well before the 1980s. This was becoming a problem in the 1960s. If you look at some Olympic issues, weightlifting issues with European teams and some of the communist bloc countries where this was undergoing development in different phases. It hasn't quite touched baseball at that point yet, but very curious. Some of the Facebook pages that I look at, we see a 1988 picture, 1987 picture of Mark McGwire and how thin he looks. Barry Bonds, the same thing. You look at him as in a Pittsburgh Pirates uniform. He doesn't look anything like an imposing figure that he later came to be seen as. Again, the pernicious effects of the drugs really in the steroid era became an issue in the 1990s. And I just touch on that a little bit again because of the way I want to keep my time frame constricted. But the big issue of cocaine at this problem, the major league level, was very, very unfortunate.
Well, let's take some questions from the audience. We have a couple that have come in. One comes in from Ryan. Ryan wants to know if Bowie Kuhn had gotten reelected in the mid-1980s, how might that have changed this period of baseball history? What do you think, Paul?
Interesting question. Baseball might have suffered a little bit of sclerosis just because of having the quote unquote the same stuffed shirt holding office again year after year. However, in the course of digging into the Kuhn papers, I found this particular memo in Kuhn's own writing. Fortunately, I was not able to reproduce the original. I did check with the folks at the Hall of Fame, and because of copyright issues, I was not able to produce the original memo as a picture. But nonetheless, if I can read this little passage here, this speaks to a little bit of foresight that Kuhn exhibited in one particular meeting. By the time Kuhn entered what would be his final year in office, the commissioner remained involved with baseball's long-range planning committee and its interest in expansion. As autumn of 1983 approached, more than 20 cities spread across many time zones were listed in the commissioner's notes as potential sites for new ball clubs. This is in Kuhn's own handwriting, by the way, which is why I found it so compelling. There were the usual domestic prospects such as Buffalo, Denver, New Orleans, Phoenix, Tampa, Miami, Washington, along with a host of surprising entries: Brooklyn, New Jersey, broadly speaking, metropolitan New York area, San Antonio, Columbus, Louisville, Indianapolis, and Honolulu, but also included were some south of the border and in the Caribbean, Mexico City, Caracas, the Dominican Republic, San Juan, in Canada, in Vancouver, and in the Far East, Tokyo, Osaka, Seoul, and Taiwan. Cune also jotted down the possibility of a third major league entering the fray, as well as the formation of a club that would serve two regional cities, for example, Miami and Tampa being a case in point. What was so interesting in following the game of baseball, and thank you, Bruce, for bringing up this slide, the first city that I mentioned there, Denver, I recall reading both in the Sporting News and the Boston Globe and Peter Gammon's columns, it seemed like hardly a month went by that there wasn't some attempt by Marvin Davis, a very wealthy oil man, to buy a team or somehow prompt Major League Baseball to put an expansion team in Denver. He was really thirsty for baseball. And Marvin Davis was probably the highest example you could think of as somebody who really wanted to get involved with baseball and bring it to a brand new market. Of course, the Colorado Rockies did finally take shape in the early 1990s, but this is going on seemingly, every couple months. There's some rumor about Denver being backed by Marvin Davis's money for getting a team, and it's important to see this particular memo in Cune's own handwriting, not just the American cities, but broadening the scope of baseball into the Caribbean, other foreign destinations. And this has taken root in some small ways. That we had a Red Sox Yankees mini series over in London a couple of years ago. We've had series openings in Mexico City and also in Japan. So trying to extend the reach of Major League Baseball and broaden its horizons to an international stage is been successful to a degree. I'm not so sure how far that's going to carry. And again, so much has been changed because of the COVID world now that, foreign travel for purposes of baseball, I think we're probably years away from getting back to what little we had accomplished in the international sense. But nonetheless, by finding this information in the Cune papers and seeing that, wow, this goes back to actually 1983, that people were actually talking about foreign baseball in really far-flung places like Tokyo and in Hawaii. So it's quite compelling to see this as part of the landscape of baseball wanting to expand its horizons and, again, cater to those gathering crowds.
Of the four franchises that you listed here, Denver's got a team now. Tampa's got a team now. Buffalo temporarily has the Blue Jays. The only city here that's never had Major League Baseball of any kind is Louisville. Is Louisville just not big enough a city? Can they convert the Downs into a ballpark?
I included Louisville on this list because I recall their time, and I'm not sure what Major League franchise they might be connected with now, but in the 1980s, they were the AAA team of the St. Louis Cardinals, and they just had a wonderful experience with drawing. Comparing them to Oakland at that time is a very poor example because Oakland was just on the downslide. Even when they had championship teams, they did not draw well because there was such a distaste for Charlie Finley, the team's owner. But Louisville itself, I think they had one year they drew like 700,000 people to a minor league ballpark. That it was exciting. It was the place to go, relatively cheaper than going to a major league game. So Louisville got some mention as being a possible site of a major league franchise. So I felt it was important to include that on the list because the time frame that all these discussions were going on, that Louisville was in the hunt, New Orleans was in the hunt, and the four graphics that we have there with Oakland, San Francisco, the White Sox, and also the Indians. This was important because those teams in particular always seem to be rumored of going to one place or another. For Charlie Finley's purposes, it seemed like once he even purchased Oakland back in the 1960s, the first thing he was doing is trying to find a different place to move them. Bought the team in 1961 when they were at Kansas City Athletics, moved them to Oakland in 1968, but he was always keeping his eyes out, looking to see where he can move the team. The pastures are always greener someplace else other than where he happened to be at any given point in time. The Giants were falling into the same doldrums too, that they were rumored to be going to Tampa. They were looking for another place to go because they were playing in Candlestick Park at that time, dreadfully cold. It was always windy. It was very fan unfriendly as far as the climate goes. I can speak to that for the only 2 games I ever went to there. I went one afternoon, it was beautifully sunshine. It was windy as all get out. And then the next day was cloudy and overcast. It was about 15 degrees warmer. The weather was just so capricious that it didn't help matters with fan attendance. The White Sox, again, another franchise playing in Comiskey Park that was long past the end of its service life. And the White Sox, I remember specifically, were thinking of relocating to Tampa. And Cleveland was another one, playing a dreadful municipal stadium, was referred to as the Mistake by the Lake, an oversized stadium that only had a couple thousand people coming every game because they had a lousy team. Nobody wanted to go to the ballpark. So they were always seemingly looking for a new home. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here with regard to possible shifting of franchises. But expansion itself, that never took place until the early 1990s, when finally we had the new division of baseball into 3 divisions each from the then existing 2 divisions in each league.
It's interesting, Paul, that of the 4 teams that you have up on the screen here, 3 are pretty stable now. San Francisco, they of course have found themselves a new ballpark. They're doing very well. There's never talk really about the White Sox moving, at least not that I've heard of. And the Indians, since moving into Jacobs Field, now Progressive Field, they have done quite well. Oakland, though, is still a concern. That is a possibility of that franchise moving, maybe somewhere else in Northern California, maybe to Las Vegas. Who knows what other cities might come up in the conversation. There's a lot more that we could cover. As you can tell, Paul has a wide-ranging number of themes that he details in his book. We want to give you some information about the book. If you would like to order it, you can go to the publisher's website. It's Rowman.com. That's ROWMAN.com. And if you purchase Paul's book, Gathering Crowds, you can get 30% off with the promo code, and that is RLFANDF30. I have no idea what those numbers and letters stand for. Maybe they have no significance at all, but put them in, and that's your promo code, RLFANDF30. Paul, before we let you go, one last question from the audience, from Bobby Barnes. Is Mr. Hensler's next book going to be about the 1990s?
I've not decided that yet. My next book is actually almost complete, but it's going to have a very, very limited audience. My high school here I live just outside my original hometown in central Connecticut. My high school from 1970 to 1972 compiled a 64-game winning streak. And next year is the 50th anniversary of the ending of that streak. I've written a book. I have most of the narrative. The narrative is probably about 98% done. I'm publishing a book, probably going to be a self-published effort to commemorate that particular winning streak. So that's been taking my attention away from Major League Baseball for most of the pandemic, actually. But it's a fun project. I really enjoyed it. I have one more interview to do, and I'll be moving on to something else after that. But Major League Baseball in the late 80s or the early 1990s, I haven't really given it too much thought because my high school project is really taken me away from all of that. So we'll see what happens in the future, but I appreciate the question.
What's the name of your high school, Paul?
Naugatuck High School.
Naugatuck.
Yes, and if you remember that wonderful man-made cloth, if you will, man-made fabric called Naugahyde. That's the hybrid of where it comes from. And if you ate Peter Paul Mounds back a few years ago, we made Peter Paul candy here as well. So, and Pro-Ked sneakers that were worn by many NBA teams years ago.
Yeah. Very good. Again, the book is Gathering Crowds, Catching Baseball Fever in the New Era of Free Agency, published by Rowman and Littlefield. Go to their website, Rowman.com. And if you punch in that promo code, you will get a 30% discount. Paul, as always, we thank you for being with us. It's always good to talk to an old friend. We hope to see you here in Cooperstown very shortly. Thanks for being with us, Paul.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, Bruce. And again, enjoy the rest of the summer, and thank you so much for the time.
We'll enjoy the rest of the summer. Thankfully, the restrictions have been lifted and the weather has actually been good lately. So we hope that does continue this spring and summer-like weather here in central New York. Our thanks to Paul Hensler. Also, our thanks to the Ford Motor Company. It is through their generous support that we're able to bring these programs to you free of charge. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. Have a great day. Take care.